Chapter 9. The Fern Brigade. Jesse and Daisy were just entering the deep woods when Jesse noticed a stirring in the ferns growing near the base of the Douglas fir. Maybe it was just a chipmunk, but Jesse didn't want anything messing with the tree while its dryad wasn't in residence to defend itself. Hold up, he said to Daisy. I need to check out those ferns. Daisy nodded and stopped, but she wasn't paying much attention. Her mind was on their plan. It would be a long drop from the side of the ramp down to the ground in the cavern. If they figured out a way to drop down from the top of the big book, perhaps the magical shield would break their fall. On the other hand, it might squeak and give them away. She looked over to Jesse to share these thoughts, but he was nowhere to be seen. Hey, Jess, she called out. Where'd you go? What do you mean? He said. He sounded close by, but Daisy couldn't see him. Are you behind the Douglas fir? She asked. I'm in front of it, in the ferns, in plain sight. Do you need glasses? Maybe, because I'm looking right at the fern. I can't see you. Well, look harder, Jesse said, popping back into view and walking towards Daisy. Whoa. Wait a sec, Jess. Daisy held up her hand. Jesse stopped. Back up to the ferns again. This struck Jesse as a strange request, but he backed up. The ferns made a swishing sound on his ankles. He stood there and watched her face. There was a look of amazement on it. Jess, this is incredible, she said, jumping up and down. I see the ferns moving, but I don't see you. You're invisible. What? When you stand in the ferns, you're 100% invisible. Let's change places and see if it works for me. Jesse stood there where Daisy had been, and Daisy went to take his place in the ferns. Jesse watched as his cousin simply slipped out of sight. Do you realize how great this is? Daisy's voice said. Jesse thought it was cool, but it was also kind of creepy. What's causing it? Come here, said Daisy. Help me choose a couple of nice fat ferns. The bigger and bushier, the better. Jesse hesitated and then joined Daisy in the fern bed. He still couldn't see her, but he heard her breathing next to him. He asked her, Why are you fern picking? Daisy said, Because the ferns have magical properties, Jess. I read about it in one of my plant books, and you proved it. Before he could stop her, he had launched into one of her botanical lectures. The fern is one of the most ancient plants on the earth. In medieval times, people thought the fern could make them invisible. The Green Man, a mythical character and dates back practically to the caveman days, covered his face with a mask of ferns to make himself invisible. So you think that Emmy's hatching made ferns magic again, like in the old days? Jesse said thoughtfully. Exactly. And the reason St. George hasn't sucked the magic out of them is because they're growing in a safe place beneath one of the two free trees. So Miss Elodie's protective spell is covering them. Exactly, Daisy replied again. It makes complete sense when you think about it. These two look good. Let's step away from the fern patch and see what happens. Jesse went back to the path, but he couldn't see Daisy. Are you still in the fern patch? She laughed in his ear. I'm right next to you. Funny, I don't feel invisible. The next moment, the ground was visible and two large ferns floated between them. Can you see me now? She asked. Wow, said Jesse. As long as I hold the ferns, you can't see me, said Daisy. Cool, said Jesse. My turn. Try with just one fern. Jesse bent down and picked up a fern. He could tell by the look in Daisy's eyes that she could no longer see him. He sneaked around and stood behind Daisy, tapping her on the shoulder. She whirled to face him. He dropped the fern, grinning. We can each hold one. Sneak down in the cavern and steal the gold pickaxe. St. George won't know what hit him. That's what I call a plan, said Daisy. They did a quick, happy prospector dance before choosing 2 fresh ferns and continuing down the path into the deep woods. On the way, Daisy noticed that Jessie kept getting in her way and jostling her. She kept stepping on his toe. We're going to need to stay close together when we use these, she said as they walked. Course, said Jessie. I mean, really close. We'll have to hold hands, said Daisy. Really, said Jessie. How come? Because otherwise we don't know where the other one is. If we hold hands, at least we can feel each other's presence. Got it? Of course, said Jessie. He took Daisy's hand, just to practice. It felt funny, like being a little kid again. We shouldn't talk or make any noise either. The ferns might make us invisible, but they won't hide sound. Good thinking, said Daisy, as they come to the edge of the clearing. They stopped and stared. The clearing was empty. There were no St. George, no hobgoblins, and no machinery. Not a single tool anywhere. Not even a high mountain of dirt had disappeared. For a minute, Jessie was afraid St. George had gone and removed all traces of himself from like he did from the college. Then he saw a large rectangular patch in the middle of the clearing. Jessie led Daisy towards it, with their invisible hands locked and the ferns held tight. Jessie and Daisy stood and looked down into the hole. The wood ramp they had walked up earlier that morning was still there. They both took big, deep breaths and tiptoed down underneath the cavern. Hopefully, halfway down the ramp, they stopped. They could see St. George. He was lounging on the hobgoblin's queen's throne, holding the golden pickaxe. But it didn't look very golden. It looked crusted with dirt and rust. St. George was rubbing the pickaxe briskly with something that looked like a scrubbing brush. The slayer paused and lifted the pickaxe to examine it. The very tip of one prong was now bright gold. St. George lowered the pickaxe and went back to work. Jessie felt Daisy tugging him slowly but steadily backwards, up the ramp and into the clearing, where she stopped and laid down her fern. He did the same. Okay, she said. We didn't plan for him to actually be holding the pickaxe. I say we go back down, get super close to him, and the minute he lays down the pickaxe, whammo, we grab it and take off. Through the tunnel to a royal lowness? Jessie said. But what if he doesn't take a break? Did you see that thing? It's filthy. He could be cleaning for hours. And what if one of us burps or sneezes or something while we're waiting? He's bound to hear us. And then what? Good point, Daisy said as she went back to thinking. So, you think we should? What? Just go down there and yank it from him? Daisy said. I think if you can distract him, I can get away from him, Jessie said. Daisy was surprised. Really? She said. Yes, said Jessie. They quickly revised their plan. It wasn't completely satisfactory. They didn't know for a fact that the pickaxe would become invisible once it was in Jessie's possession, but they had to assume that it would. The pack on Jessie's back was as invisible as he was when the fern was in his hand, so it seemed possible. When they were finished planning, they nodded and solemnly picked up their ferns. All right then, said Jessie. His heart was thudding. They were as ready as they were ever going to be. They reached out and found each other's hand. They held tight to their ferns and stole back down the ramp. They walked all the way down and across the cavern to the Hobgoblin Queen throne. They stopped about a foot away from St. George. Jesse recoiled from the man's rotting meat breath, and his hand that held the fern trembled. The hand holding Daisy's was slick with sweat. St. George went completely still for a moment. Then his nostrils started to twitch. He can smell us, Jesse thought. And that's where we've got to stop today. We will do part 2 of chapter 9 tomorrow.